Well, hello, Dr. Susan Mayne. Thank you so much for coming on Food Truths. It is a pleasure to have you here.
It's good to be with you, Eric, today.
So, Susan, you have led a very interesting professional life, and you were my favorite type of person to interview. You made a name for yourself as an academic studying food and nutrition. You became a world leader at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, pushing for safer and more healthy food. And now you're helping others do the same. Now, I want to get into that a little bit. But for those listening, the Food and Drug Administration, FDA, where we both previously worked, and for those listening, Dr. Mayne was one of my bosses at when I was at FDA as a young regulator. FDA was initially set up as an outgrowth of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Most people don't know that. And it was called the Bureau of Chemistry. And what eventually became the FDA was tasked with the chemical analysis of agricultural products to ensure food safety. And it has grown, obviously, quite a bit since then. And Dr. Mayne knows better than anyone because it is the oldest consumer protection agency in the US. And most people don't know that. But most importantly, and for today's conversation, Dr. Mayne is the F in FDA, or at least led that most recently at the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition. And I think that one, if you could just take us through a little bit of like what that has entailed, we'd love to talk a little bit about that as leading the food safety side, what that meant on a day-to-day basis, and also as the center director, you were the first and only to date woman to lead CFSAN, the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition. So I'm just curious, what has that been like to step into a life of public service and then step back out of that role?
Thank you for the question. I spent 3 decades in academics first, and then had the opportunity to step into public service. And I was recruited by the FDA. Had a tremendous opportunity during the Obama administration where the First Lady was very committed to improving nutrition in this country. And one of the reasons they wanted me to come was to help provide that scientific basis and help advance and lead some of those really important nutrition initiatives that occurred during the Obama administration. So that was simply an opportunity I couldn't pass up. I held an endowed chair at Yale, but this was a better deal than that. And so I couldn't pass it up. That opportunity to work on something so important that could impact people at the national level. So I knew not a lot about CFSAN. When I went into that role, I had sat on an advisory committee for the FDA before, but I certainly was not well versed in all the different aspects of the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition. So I had to learn a lot about that job before I went, and then once I got immersed into the work of CFSAN and the FDA. And one of the things I quickly learned is that it is an immense job. CFSAN and the FDA oversee 80% of the US food supply. They're responsible for all the food ingredients, as you know very well. Also, labeling of the foods that they regulate is essentially most of the food supply, with the exception of meat and poultry products. And so the mission is broad. I was overseeing, by the time I left, about 1,100 people in the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition. It's one of the 6 FDA centers. There are centers for drugs, Center for Foods. It was one of the 6 FDA centers. So I quickly tried to learn from many of the other center directors in terms of what do I really need to know and how do I do this job most successfully. I had a strong team to help support me in an immensely big job, but a job that I really truly loved, and I appreciated so much the opportunity to have that job for 8.5 years.
Yes, and we worked together on quite a few interesting projects, one might say, during that time.
For
We'll get
sure.
to later. Yeah, so um, I, I guess also what people that I didn't even realize until I worked at FDA as well was the sort of by just sort of population size, the drug part, there's quite a everything, the centers all kind of tangentially or directly relate to drugs, and only one directly relates to human food, more or less. And so an immense amount of responsibility is concentrated upon the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition. And would you say that how did that play out in terms of your approach to working with other parts of FDA and the public in general? Do you think people knew that? And if even if they didn't, how do you think you tried to get the word out differently as center director?
Yeah, I think a lot of people don't fully appreciate, how the constraints you have within the foods program. And one I will talk about right immediately is essentially resourcing. And the foods program, human foods program, is very different than the medical product centers, the drug centers, et cetera, because they have essentially no user fees. And so that means that the only resources we really have are those that Congress would appropriate to the center. So it has certainly got a disparity in terms of its funding. And I think it's well known around the FDA and in Washington that the foods program is under resourced, especially compared to the drug centers. I think that is widely understood and recognized. I often hear people who have criticized FDA and say, well, put the F back in FDA. Why don't you take some of those drug dollars and channel them over to the foods program to really help people? Chronic disease, the impact would be enormous. The challenge there is that Congress appropriates them specifically to activities that function within the centers. So the agency really has no ability to take money that's specified for the drugs side of FDA and move it over to foods. And even within the foods program, Congress specifies how much of that is to be spent on things like food safety versus nutrition. So it's pretty prescriptive in terms of how you can allocate those resources. So part of my job was to say, well, given the resources we have, what strategies do we want to have to get the biggest public health bang for the buck on the resources that we have available?
And if speaking of resourcing, I don't think people realize, again, just like any job, and especially a leader and manager, you are constantly thinking about budgeting as well as sort of just the logistics of running an organization. If you had to rank sort of the top three sort of daily activities you had to do as center director and in charge of the foods program here in the United States, what would they be? Would any of them sort of surprise the average person listening?
I'd say probably one of the more time-consuming ones was simply being briefed on all the different types of actions that were going on in the center, and that I was ultimately responsible for, and would have to defend in terms of with members of Congress, with media, et cetera. So a lot of my time was spent learning about the different issues and being prepared to really communicate those. So as the leader, you are oftentimes the lead communicator with media and with members of Congress. So that was a huge amount of my time. Also, meeting the needs of the workforce from scientific perspective to the technologies we had available, really meeting the needs so that the workforce could be optimally empowered to deliver on the work that they have to get done. And things like IT modernization are hugely important to better efficiencies in the government. And some of those are areas that we worked on as well. And then the third one is really just telling the story. I spent a lot of time going to scientific conferences, presenting at meetings, explaining why we do what we do. I think as public health professionals, it's so important that we communicate and communicate why we're taking the steps we're taking. And really making it clear to the public at large why FDA exists and what are the actions we're taking and what impact it has for consumers.
And so you're a nutrition scientist as well, and you were practicing in academia, as you said, considerably before then. I can imagine, obviously, that's a very natural fit for leading the food side of FDA. I'm curious, what are some of the more interesting disciplines you learned once you got to FDA? Like, because FDA houses a lot of different of experts from lots of different areas related to food and food science. So, what was sort of the most interesting thing you picked up in your time? As sort of, as scientists, we pick up lots of other disciplines on our journey.
I would say for me, I had a hard science background, biochemistry, toxicology, chemicals. I had worked on chemicals and chemical carcinogenesis in my training. So the scientific aspects for a lot of what were doing was very familiar to me. Even in the department that I led at the Yale School of Public Health, we had behavioral scientists. And so I was familiar with consumer research and qualitative and quantitative studies and focus groups in that whole area of research. So those were all familiar to me. But what was really new to me was really how all of that work intersects with legal.
Mhm.
And I had taken a course in the law school when I was at Cornell and where I did my PhD work. I was interested in tort law and things like that, so I had some minimal training in law, but I had to get a crash course when I came to FDA on food and drug law. And teams of lawyers came to my office and really explained to me the legal framework in which FDA operates. And with every particular issue, we had to really learn and be aware of the legal guardrails, the legal tools that FDA would have to address these things. And so it's really science policy, but the legal really sets that framework in many, many different cases. So learning that was really important to me as a regulator.
And in that same vein, what about federal service and public service? How's that impacted one, your scientific outlook, if at all? Like how do you look at science now that you're back in academia after this tenure? And also how has it affected your views as a consumer of food? I'm curious about that as well.
Yeah, so going from academics to the regulatory world, and we had labs. Probably about a third of my employees were lab scientists, and so I learned a lot about those labs. I visited those labs. I got to see what they were working on and what they were doing. And there are some striking differences in terms of the science that you do in the federal agencies versus that you do in academics. And one of the things I would say is the emphasis on scientific rigor, in my estimation, is higher in the federal agencies because every single scientific piece could potentially be be litigated, as we're moving forward to make policy based upon that science. So the scientific rigor is extremely high. The conditions under which the science are done, very, very high, and it is really cutting edge. And in fact, one of the reasons I was also very interested to join the FDA was that I was involved in some whole genome sequencing work when I was at Yale. And when I learned what FDA was just starting, which was whole genome sequencing of pathogens to help inform foodborne outbreak investigations, I thought that was one of the most innovative aspects of whole genome sequencing that I'd ever considered. So I helped build that program over the next decade or so. And now whole genome sequencing, which was led out of CIFSAN, is considered probably one of the most important, if not the most important, scientific advancement in foodborne illness, food safety globally. And now we're seeing other countries that are following the US's lead and implementing whole genome sequencing. Europe is doing it, others are doing it now as well. So to be at that cutting edge of science and know that it's being applied immediately to solve foodborne outbreak investigations is just really exciting. And it's work that I'm very proud of. I think it's probably one of the best examples and most successful examples we've ever had of molecular epidemiology to improve public health.
I agree, and I think that was part of the reason that I was so excited to be a civil servant was seeing the cutting edge work that I have just come out of in my doctoral work being applied to make the food supply safer. And I think that's something most people don't realize when they're thinking of the government. Think of it as obviously it can be a slow bureaucracy and it's hard to turn around an oil tanker, but I don't think people realize how in these science-based organizations how nimble they can and usually are in terms of keeping up with the science because they're constantly bombarded with the newest thing that people want to see if they can sell or if it's safe. And one example we can talk about is cultivated meat, as you're well aware. But I think I completely agree. I think that's very important for people to know about the federal service.
Yeah, and I'd like to say, the labs in CIFSAN were just top notch, and they had to be because we never knew what might be coming at us. We could have some contamination event where people are getting sick or even dying from food, and immediately people are going to say, "What's causing this?" And we had to have those analytical chemists and those people on staff to be able to address those kinds of questions in real time. So while regulatory can be slow when you're talking about things like rulemaking, responding when there's a contamination event has to be really rapid. And I was really proud of the labs that we had. They're globally recognized. And when we had events in other countries, for example, there was an issue with some food poisoning that occurred in the World Food Program. There were two labs they went to around the globe to try to solve that contamination and why were people getting sick and dying. And one of them was the CIFSAN lab. And so these folks are just tremendous, and they get called when there's any kind of a disaster as well. When we had the Deepwater Horizon spill,
Mm.
and we had petroleum products being spilled into the water, people immediately said, "Is the seafood safe? Can you harvest seafood from this area?" And we had to deploy analytical chemists to develop assays and figure out immediately, could that seafood be harvested from that region or not. So people have to be able to respond quickly, and you need to have a repository, a number of people in those labs ready to go, trained with the strongest analytical instrumentation to be able to address those kinds of challenges in real time when they come. And I don't think that's something that consumers necessarily are always aware of.
Right. Well, most importantly, could you eat the seafood? What was the determination?
The
I'm sure that it
determination,
depends.
that was before I got to FDA, but my understanding is that yes, they were able to harvest the seafood there. They had to test it, obviously, to make sure that there were not residues that would make it, adulterated food that would need to not enter into
Yeah.
commerce. But those are the kinds of questions that come up, whether it's PFAS contamination. We've seen that environmental contamination zones, FDA gets called. Can this product that's grown in an area with known environmental contamination enter the food supply? FDA is called to address that, which may, involve developing those assays, interpreting the data, and working with states and other localities to make sure that the food supply remains safe.
I often think you just described a situation I think most people are unaware of. That in these important regulatory positions, whether they be food or drugs, and especially in your leadership position, your job isn't to make what I would call easy calls. Your job is to settle the 4951 type decisions where it could go either way depending on the situation, the context, but the consequences are significant either way. And it sounds like you relied heavily on the technical acumen of your staff to be able to provide you with the right read on what's the right way to go. Um, does that seem fair to say that?
Absolutely, that's fair. And I am a scientist, and I've always said that as a regulator, the most important thing to me was the science. And I really needed to understand it, to ask the right questions, in those briefings so I could be comfortable with the science and direct areas that I felt that we needed to be moving forward into with regard to some of that science. So that was really my job, to do that. And the science really was underpinning all of those types of regulatory decisions. So yeah, it's a really important thing. And when I first came to CIFSAN, I was asked on my second day in the center, I don't know if you were there for that day, but I was asked to address all the employees as a new director. And that they said to me, they wanted to hear from me how I was going to lead CIFSAN. And I said, well, I need to learn a lot about the center before I can be very granular in how I intend to lead CIFSAN. But I can tell you that there's three things that are going to be most important to me as a director. And those were my three core values. First was first, do good science. Second was treat everyone with respect. And third is be as transparent as possible. And so that's essentially that was what I said on day two, and that was my experience over the next 8.5 years, is first do good science, because that is the most important part of decision making as a regulator.
So I would say like my that echoes a sort of approach I take on the private sector side, where I look for great organizations have a combination of what I'll call a culture of curiosity and a culture of gratitude. Um, you're very, you, which I think embodies a lot of what you're talking about, and especially in a technical organization like CIFSAN. Um, being curious about the world around you and the others you work with who know different things than you know, as well as being grateful that you have this opportunity to learn from these folks and work together on solving larger problems than you would have solved on your own. I think that's what I took away a lot from my time at FDA. But I wanted to say also, speaking of how you lead and how you've chosen to lead, you led the implementation of the Food Safety Modernization Act, one of the most comprehensive reshapings of American food law since the ratification of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act nearly 100 years ago. It is it was no small task. I was there. I remember, and I can only imagine what it was like for you, having to take the lead on this. So I would love to hear a little bit about what it took to design, align, implement this brand new law, these sets of regulations. I remember I didn't even see a lot of my colleagues for a while, for months, because they joined you and your forces to sort of implement. But I'd love to hear from your side what it took to get this off the ground, and this historic piece of legislation in action.
Certainly. So FSMA was signed during the Obama administration, and then when those types of laws are passed, like the Food Safety Modernization Act, there's essentially handoff to the federal agencies, and what the agencies have to do is to interpret those laws and to make sure that industry knows what their obligations would be to really execute those laws. So passing the law is really just the first step. And then the agencies have a tremendous amount of work ahead of them. In the case of FSMA, there were 7 foundational rules that had to be developed and put together. And that was really to shift the food supply to a prevention oriented framework. And I'm sure you're familiar with some of those foundational rules. And it's, from the manufacturing facilities to the produce farms to the way that food is transported, prevention against, adulteration, all throughout. And so the rulemaking was an intensive amount of work in the center. Like all rulemaking, it's a very public process. So there are stakeholder meetings, extensive stakeholder meetings, because these were going to be rules that were dramatically going to impact industry, including farmers. And so to really understand from the stakeholders what's feasible and how could this be implemented in a feasible way is very, very critical to developing FSMA rules and any other rules as well. So public meetings, stakeholder engagement, et cetera. Then there were the proposed rules that go out for public comment, and then more comments and more feedback, and then finally get to the final rules. A lot of the very early engagement was done before I got there. And so all of those initial rules and some of the early public comment periods, but I was there for the finish line, is trying to get these things across the finish line and dealing with many of the most contentious and difficult issues in the FSMA foundational rules. And I'd say it was challenging in the center. We did essentially have to sequester some of our people. And the reason is it's a very busy place. They're working on enormous amount of things all the time. And we were under court ordered deadlines to get these rules out. So we literally had to sequester people and say, you're getting off of these things and you're going to work on rulemaking so that we can meet our court order deadlines. But they also had to consult with the experts in the center who were incredibly busy. So our produce safety experts are advising on outbreaks at the same time they're advising on rulemaking for the produce safety rule. And so it's just a very, very busy time when you put on top of a busy organization the task of coming up with 7 foundational rules that were going to radically shift the way we do food safety in the United States. The last comment I'll say is that Congressional Budget Office did some estimates on what FSMA would need in terms of federal resources to be fully implemented. FDA received somewhere around half of what the Congressional Budget Office estimated would be needed to implement FSMA. So we did receive some new resources, but not what CBO estimated would be needed to do this work. And so we were under-resourced on top of already being under-resourced before FSMA was launched. So the resource challenges were real and continued during those years.
I hear that, and I remember that even during the good times, if you will, when I was there too, we still felt the pain. You're always running at a slight deficit in terms of resources. I felt like, and so uh, trying to get things done efficiently, you learn to prioritize a lot of the work, which I think don't think people realize is a huge part of being a civil servant. I think it's prioritizing what you're going to be able to work on at any given time. What um what do you wish, speaking of FSMA, like I just wanted to talk a little bit more about what do you wish consumers knew a little bit more about, like how this has affected their lives, or like because it has, its intention was to make the food supply safer than it already was. So how does that manifest in the everyday life of someone purchasing food?
I think there's always a tension, the tension between the safest possible food supply, which the agency is always working on, but also the changing nature of the food supply. And that is, if you look at what our food supply looks like today, it is much more globalized than it's ever been. Like more than 90% of our seafood comes in from abroad, a large proportion of our fruits and vegetables, many food ingredients. We learned that during COVID, and many food ingredients come in from other countries. And so the nature of the food supply has changed over time, which it makes it more challenging as a regulator to oversee all of that. At the same time, you have new tools through FSMA to help facilitate that. So there's kind of that tension between changing food supplies and greater tools to work on food safety. But the scope is vast. The center and the foods program, Human Foods Program, oversees about 275,000 food manufacturing facilities, half of which are in other countries, approximately 30,000 produce farms. And so the scope of the work is vast. And so I just want to highlight that. And so as you see changes in the food supply and where our foods come from, that can impact the regulatory work. And all it takes is one ingredient from another country that is unsafe to come in and be incorporated into US foods and cause a food safety problem. And one of the best examples we have of that is work that is something that happened after I left, which was the contamination of cinnamon with lead.
Mm.
That lead contaminated cinnamon made its way into many products in the US food supply, in particular products destined for children. And next thing you know, we've got lead contamination in the US food supply because a producer in Ecuador did not do a satisfactory job making sure that that spice would not contaminate with lead. And those are the challenges the agency has. It's not just a global food supply, but global ingredients going into that global food supply and trying to assure safety.
Yeah, and most people don't realize there's no safe amount of lead that can be in your food. It's almost unavoidable. And you are also one of the things of the many things you did is initiate or implement the Closer to Zero initiative, if I'm correct, right?
That is
Um,
correct.
and why that's so important regarding especially lead in our food. You want to speak a little bit more to that?
Yeah, so you are correct. There is no safe level for lead in food. And there's other mineral elements or other elements as well. We call them toxic elements. Things like arsenic, inorganic arsenic, cadmium, mercury. These are neurodevelopment toxicants, and so you really do not want these things in the diets, especially of infants and young children when the brain is developing. That's when they can have the greatest um, uh, adverse harm, being exposed to those elements. So they are in the environment, lead, cadmium, mercury, they're all in the environment, and arsenic as well. And the question is, where do you start as a regulator? How do you reduce exposures to these when they're already in the environment? So one of the things I asked the folks in CIFSAN to do is to figure out, well, where, we can't tackle everything in every food all at once. But what we can do is we can use science to decide where are the risks the greatest, where do we have the potential to reduce exposure by the greatest amount, and let's start with the big ones first, and then we'll start working on lesser sources of exposure. So the first one I tackled, and it was one of the ones I started with at FDA, was inorganic arsenic in infant rice cereal. Infant rice cereal is by far the predominant source of exposure to arsenic in infant diets. And so we knew if we wanted to have an impact, that's where we should start. So we moved forward on a plan and a pathway to reduce infant exposure to inorganic arsenic, worked very closely with the rice growers, USA Rice Foundation and others, worked very closely with USDA and the Agricultural Research Service on how can we reduce the amount of arsenic in rice and how do we make sure that the lowest arsenic rice is going to be sourced into the infant food market. So by doing all of that, we set some action levels, we worked with industry, and after a few years, we were able to determine that the amount of arsenic in the infant rice cereal had decreased almost 30%. So despite the fact that it's an unavoidable contaminant in our environment, there are strategies that can be taken based upon science and data and other approaches, and that was one of the early ones that we worked on.
For people listening, since you know a lot about this, the forms of rice that are most I've heard and read that obviously you have white rice, brown rice, and then brown rice syrup. Brown rice syrup being used a lot as a sweetener and sort of nutrition bars and what have you as an alternative to sugar. Of those three, do you have any relative, like off the top of your head, if you remember the lead content ratios, basically? Like, is one particularly worse than the other, or are they all about the same?
I think you mean arsenic, not lead on
Oh,
this one. Yep.
sorry, arsenic. Yeah,
Yeah.
correct.
I mean, it's well known that on average, brown rice is higher than white rice in terms of inorganic arsenic. But it is complicated. And, there are even differences amongst different types of white rice. And so, one of the things that technology and genomics and agriculture can look at is which types of crops are most likely to take up that arsenic. And can we select for crops, even within those categories, that are less likely to take up arsenic? So, there's a lot of research looking at that for public health purposes. But on average, brown rice is higher in arsenic than white rice is. But at the same time, brown rice has other nutrients that it's higher in compared to white rice. And so it raises the issue that we often had to consider at CIFSAN is the balance looking at food safety and nutrition at the same time. People have often asked me, why is nutrition and food safety in the same center? And that's because they interrelate all the time. And just, contaminants in produce is an obvious example here. If you told people avoid exposure to these contaminants, they would be avoiding exposure to fruits, vegetables, grains, and everything that comes out of the earth. And so there's that consideration where you always have to look at nutrition as well as food safety simultaneously. And so that's an example where we had to do that and make sure consumers are best informed when they're making those types of choices.
Exactly. And there's no easy way. And this gets to I love FDA has sort of multiple definitions in my from my memory of safety, and the one I always think of the word salad, but still true is the reasonable certainty of no harm is what we would define as safety, and then the quantitative way is effectively safety is risk, the total amount of a system minus the risk that's present in terms of the hazards you might be encountering. um, how how did you think about safety and food safety? Like, what was the operational definition you used, if it was slightly different or modified from what FDA would say in general? But I'm curious, as a scientist, how you approached safety and how you do approach it philosophically, I guess.
So I'd say the first thing is that there is a legal definition the agency is bound to. So it starts with the law,
Mhm.
and that is the reasonable certainty of no harm standard that is specified
Mhm.
in law, the one that you know so well. So it starts with the law, but then of course there's the ways that as scientists we have to think about it and the ways that we have to take action on it. And I think one of the things that consumers don't always understand, and this is something toxicologists are trained to be aware of from day one, is that the dose is what's really relevant. And the Paracelsus, hundreds of years ago, told us it's the dose that matters, and that's really true. Oxygen can be toxic, water can be toxic, at high doses, and that's true with things in our food supply as well. And so, as regulators, we really look at the safety under conditions of use and considering issues like dose. And that is really important to a lot of the work that is going on in the center. And it can be challenging when people will say that a particular ingredient is harmful. It may be harmful at 6 orders of magnitude higher than any human might ever be exposed to it. So the center thinks very carefully about dose and under intended conditions of use, do they have a reasonable certainty of no harm?
Right. I remember that this also is something that's, I think, still front and center, and I think interestingly, in my experience working in the private sector, I found that most companies have a very good understanding of that concept, and sort of can align very they could overlap quite easily with the way a regulator would think about safety as well, which I find very encouraging. Actually, there's not a lot of disagreement about how safety is measured, if you will, or determined in a food product. We may disagree about how you go about that, but the overall targets are the same, which I find I think people often think companies will often try to skirt federal safety standards. And I've not found that to be true. I found the exact opposite to be true. They'll go out of their way to make sure that they are complying and making the safest product possible, because obviously that affects their bottom line if it's not. Um, I won't ask you to name any names from your work, but I'm curious if you also saw the stakeholder set that you regulated as well as largely, compliant and collegial, or did you see any adversarial relationships in those days?
No, I think the stakeholder, community definitely is supportive of food safety. Nobody wants to have an unsafe product, reputational risk, litigation if people are harmed. So, industry is very committed to producing safe foods. May often be some scientific debate about how to get there. Emerging areas of science. There's some challenging areas of science. Examples are pathogens in agricultural water, and how do you assure the safety of produce when you've got something that's grown outside and exposed to water sources? And so, getting the science right to enable industry to really meet those safety obligations, that can be debated, and that's an area where we need more work. But the commitment is there on the part of industry to produce the safest possible food.
Yeah, and how do you relate that? I mean, in terms of, sister agencies like EPA and USDA. I don't We hear often about like the open face sandwich versus the closed face sandwich and the cheese pizza versus the pepperoni pizza, and there's the absurdity of like the regulatory structure sometimes. But could you talk a little bit about one, the overlap that, we share with some of our sister agencies, and more importantly, sort of like um what those working relationships were like for you having to work with other federal agencies that regulate food or crops or agriculture?
I would say we worked very closely across administrations with other federal agencies, and again, I was in leadership during the Obama, the Trump, and the Biden administration. The agency, as I say, we work most closely with is probably USDA. There are so many areas where we need to coordinate and work together to assure not just food safety, but other aspects as well. And so things like, labeling and things like that. So we work very closely with the U.S. Department of Agriculture. We also work closely with NIH doing the research. We work closely with CDC in terms of all of their public health expertise. And the last federal agency I worked quite a bit with was EPA. And in terms of EPA, there are many different aspects of it, including contaminants that get into water. And what does that mean for agricultural products? So that was an area that we worked closely with EPA on. A big area of work was on PFAS, which tends
Mm.
to get into water and has contaminated water and therefore can contaminate produce and other crops and other products. So we work closely on PFAS, but we also worked on things like pesticides, where EPA has the authority to set what we call tolerance levels, how much of a pesticide could be in a human food. FDA doesn't determine those, EPA does, but FDA essentially enforces that through the food testing that they do to make sure that food in the US market does not exceed the levels of pesticides that EPA has established. So the agencies work very closely together, and in ways that are well understood within the agencies. It may not be as clear to the outside world, but that's a standard part of my job, was to intersect with leaders in other federal agencies to make sure that the work was progressing as needed.
That aligns to my experience as well, even on the other side of the private sector side, that FDA and USDA really do work very well and hand in hand. I will acknowledge that I feel like there's different cultures at both agencies. They've just cultivated different cultures over time. But overall, there is a commitment to food safety at its core and collegiality, and serving the consumer and enhancing consumer choice and all of those aspects. So it's good to hear that it's also true from your side as well.
Absolutely.
So I want to you bring up PFAS, and I think that's super interesting. On the other side of that coin is also you having overseen things like the safety of genetically engineered crops, and overseeing genome edited crops now as well. These what I'll call in quotes novel technologies or novel food additives, which we don't really say in the United States, but and then on top of it, also these emerging potential health trends. For example, PFAS, like forever chemicals. How did you approach these sort of what I'll call just broadly novel issues that you need to attend to, like one an emerging industry, like cultivated meat or genome edited crops, and then on the same time also these emerging potential health challenges that we face as a country too.
So I'd say we'll take one at a time maybe, but I'd say universally it always starts with the science. So beginning with PFAS, once we became aware as a federal government that PFAS, these forever chemicals, were hazardous and they were contaminating certain areas of the U.S. more so than others, it all starts with the science. So, what analytical methods do we have to measure these? And can we consistently measure these across the federal government? EPA developed a water method to measure, these are complicated analytical assays for these
Mm.
perfluorinated alkyl substances or PFAS. So, EPA developed a water method. FDA then extended it to a food matrix so that we could all be on the same wavelength in terms of what are we measuring and what does it mean. And there's lots of different PFAS compounds, which ones are in the environment, which ones are we going to measure, and what are we going to do about it. So it starts with the science. And then you have to think about, well, what can we do from a mitigation perspective if we know these chemicals are in the environment and we know that they can be damaging to health? The next step is immediately mitigation. What can EPA do to get it out of the water? What can FDA do to keep food from taking up PFAS? Or if it is taken up, what do we do to take products off the market? And so it's really following that science. And one of the first questions I was asked is, what's the evidence that diet's contributing PFAS to human exposure? And we didn't know. So we put together a sampling plan to go test the primary foods in the US food supply. We had the total diet study that was in place to estimate intake of nutrients and other things. And we started testing products in total diet study for PFAS to estimate exposure. And then we followed that science and we said, well, what are we seeing? The vast majority of the products that we tested had no detectable PFAS of the primary ones that had been found in the environment. But there was a particular type of commodity that we tended to see a higher rate of detection, and that was seafood. And so that led to some seafood sampling plans that FDA had implemented first before I left to test the major imports of seafood into this country, and subsequent work that has since been going on to try to figure out, is it there? What levels are unsafe, and do we need to remove products from the market? And products have been removed from the market or are not allowed to come into the US market based upon PFAS contamination. But we had to start with, is it even in the diet of the US? We didn't know. And so we had to follow that science.
And how did you become aware, or how did the agency become aware of it? Like, what was the primary mechanism by which, let's say, if you're aware of, I'm sure it potentially was before your time, when PFAS was something you needed to pay attention to?
I think the scientific community as a whole was starting to learn that there were toxicities with these compounds that had not been widely recognized
Mm.
in the past. And so it wasn't just CIFSAN, it was the totality of the scientific evidence that was coming out that these compounds were concerning. And so once those scientific studies indicated possible harm, it becomes all hands on deck. Let's look at that science. CIFSAN did some studies looking at whether or not some of these compounds were toxic. Other federal agencies were studying them as well, NIEHS. So federal investments to understand the compounds becomes an important piece of that.
Mm. So it's fair to say that this is almost it is effectively a collaboration between the academic scientific community, global scientific community, and of course FDA, working on and identifying these challenges, or areas that they need to maybe focus more into.
Correct.
And then how does that, would you say that's similar to how the agency would approach, again, like a novel food technology, such as a genome edited crop or a cultivated or cell cultured meat product? How do the agency, on the other hand, sort of approach these sorts of things when industry goes, hey, we got this new product. We'd really like to sell it to consumers. It's not been seen before. How, can we sell that? Can we do this? I'm oversimplifying the last 8 years of our lives together. Susan, you've also worked on a lot of things relating to the genetic engineering of food, both plants and animals and animal cells. Could you talk a little bit about genetic engineering in general, in terms of food safety and just what you learn? Because there's a lot of, I think, a lot of misinformation out there. But I'm curious, to hear from you directly what that means, and I think a lot of people listening would love to know that as well.
Sure. And first thing I'll say is that FDA has been overseeing genetically engineered crops for almost 3 decades now, and they have a remarkably strong record of safety. So there really is no debate about the safety of genetically engineered foods. In the early days, genetically engineered crops were designed primarily to have some benefits for farmers, things like resistance against insects, help fight plant viruses that may be taking down commodity crops, herbicide tolerance, things like that. But what we're seeing today is that the types of crops are shifting in time. And what we're seeing are more that are being developed to have clear benefits to consumers. And so I'll give you a few examples of some of the ones we've seen. And some of these are now entering that have been produced through genome editing rather than genetic engineering. But a few examples are things like you can genome edit a crop to improve its nutritional value. You can produce alternate sources of healthy oils. Things like soybeans have been genome edited to produce high oleic acid oils, the types of oils that our food supply needs to replace industrially produced trans fats. We're seeing things like crops that are resistant to drought. And so as we're thinking about trying to feed a global population of the future, having crops that can grow in drought conditions is really important. Reducing food waste. We oversaw the review of a genetically engineered apple that doesn't brown. And so that means that you could cut it up, you could give it to people, and it's not going to brown, and that's going to reduce food waste. Even potatoes that had been altered so that they produce less acrylamide. Acrylamide is a contaminant that is considered harmful to humans. So the techniques that are there to provide consumer benefit to our planet. If you think about things like the ability to grow crops with less pesticides. And so FDA has worked very hard to communicate some of that to consumers. And we find consumers really are not fully aware of the importance of genetic engineering and genome editing in terms of our food supply. So we do have FDA does have a consumer campaign out there called Feed Your Mind to really educate consumers about what crops are genetically engineered, why, and what did the data show. So if people are interested, I'd encourage them to look up Feed Your Mind and learn more about genetically engineered crops in the US.
I also maintain that genetic engineering, if done properly, produces some of the safest food we've ever had in the history of humanity, and potentially some of the most nutritious, depending on how it's applied. Um, and I think that's only going to get better as we learn more, as you say, first do good science, and then of course regulate it appropriately.
Correct.
That said, what's coming down the pipe in terms of the things you're seeing in food and nutrition, that you think are important to sort of keep an eye on, but whether they be like positive things like new products or categories, or like, again, like PFAS, like these chemicals that people should be worried or like concerned about. Where do you see things going right now in terms of in the food safety and food space?
Yeah, I think there's a tremendous amount of innovation going on out there. And I used to attend some of these very innovative food industry meetings to learn about new technologies on the market. And that's where I first became aware of cell cultured meat as a commodity that was going to be coming into the US market and something we were going to need to be prepared to regulate. There's also food ingredients, new food ingredients that may give consumers additional choices. One of the ones that was worked on when I was at FDA was a key ingredient in the Impossible Foods plant-based meat products. And that's an ingredient called soy leg hemoglobin, which was regulated as both a food additive and as a color additive and found to be safe. And this is an ingredient. It really can behave kind of like hemoglobin to make the plant-based meats more similar to animal meats, which may increase consumer acceptance and, again, giving consumers choices. So FDA needs to be there as a strong regulator to make sure that these innovations that can give consumers additional choices can enter the market safely. And so I will reiterate that FDA does not choose winners and losers amongst different technologies. And sometimes you will see different segments of the food industry that may be competing with each other. FDA doesn't choose winners and losers. Their job is essentially to make sure that anything that's coming into the market is safe. And the last thing I'll mention related to that issue of winners and losers is some of the things we learned during COVID and some of the things as we think about the future is having new ways of producing food like cell cultured meat. That can give us additional options. And we saw during COVID, for example, slaughterhouses that had to close because workers were getting sick with COVID and we didn't want to spread COVID through all these communities. And we saw challenges with the meat supply. And people were saying, well, if only we had cell cultured meat to help help buffer against that when we have these kinds of supply chain disruptions. If you think about things like seafood, we know that the seafood stocks are threatened globally. And we tell people they should eat seafood as part of a healthy dietary pattern, but the world doesn't have enough seafood for everybody to follow the kinds of dietary guidelines that we give to Americans. So having new approaches to bring those types of commodities to market, to give consumers choices, I view it as not in competition with traditional industries, but rather being complementary to traditional industries and helping bolster against challenges like we saw with COVID. And so we learned a lot about supply chains and vulnerabilities. And so from my perspective, having new approaches can be very, very helpful. And that includes for how to produce food ingredients, where we may be dependent, for example, on particular countries. If we can produce those domestically through different technologies, that can help bolster supply chains during times of difficulty, as we saw during COVID.
That's right. I always say it was and not or, and it's patriotic to innovate. I think it's so much fun to do this in the United States, to build, be sort of one of the leaders, if not the leader in food innovation. Okay. One of the things I ask every guest is sort of what's a hill you want to die on? What's your favorite food myth that you want to tackle and put to bed, or just in general, the hot take? But I have a feeling that yours is related to federal service, which I kind of hope it is, because I want more people to go work in the government. But what is that hill you're willing to die on, that cause de guerre that you still have, that you take with you wherever you go?
Well, I do think, especially at this moment in time, there are stated goals of reducing the size of the federal workforce. And I certainly hope that FDA is not one of those targets for reducing the size of the federal workforce. The size of CFSAN has remained roughly constant for decades. And it has a much more daunting task to regulate today than it did 30, 40 years ago. So it has not grown enormously in any way, shape, or form. It's roughly similar to where it was decades ago. So that's the first point. The second point is that having a strong FDA helps protect consumers. You started this podcast saying it's Consumer Protection Agency. It's a public health agency. It helps protect consumers, but having a strong regulator also helps protect industry. Because if industry wants to bring innovative new food products to market, they're going to need regulators to review those innovative food products to make sure that they can enter the market safely. And that's really important to assure consumer confidence as well. If FDA wasn't there and it was entirely up to industry, we know that that would impact consumer confidence. So having that regulator there is critically important. So FDA plays so many key functions in terms of things like microbial food safety and the traditional food industry. FDA's experts work with industry all the time to share the latest scientific knowledge to make sure that industry can produce the safest possible food. So I think it's really in all of our best interests, consumers, industry, all, to have a strong regulator of food at the US FDA. And so I continue to hope that it will be well resourced with the incoming administration. They have committed to try to improve the healthfulness of the food supply. They're going to need a strong FDA to be able to do that. So my plea is that please adequately resource it and preserve those federal workers who are so critical to the safety of every American every day, because we all eat food.
So yes, if you're from the new administration and you're listening, please reach out to Dr. Mayne for advice. I think she'd be more than happy to share it.
Absolutely.
And I cannot I could not emphasize this enough. I still think that the best part of my training as a scientist was working as a civil servant. I recommend it to so many young scientists and people looking for career change. I still believe it is arguably the most important thing I've ever done with my career in terms of my scientific training, because it put my scientific training in context and added a lot of layers of subtlety that wouldn't have happened otherwise. It wasn't just an academic problem, it was a real life issue. And you lived that too, probably more than anyone. So one, obviously, thank you so much for your service. It was a pleasure to be able to work with you when we did overlap, and it was a pleasure to work with you even on the other side of the negotiating table as well. And I guess lastly, what's next for Dr. Susan Mayne? What are you up to? What and where can people find you?
So I retired from the federal government in 2023. I did return back to Yale in what's called a voluntary tract, which is an adjunct professor. So I continue to have access to students, to meet with students, to mentor folks, to give seminars, to participate in seminars. So I still enjoy the intellectual engagement of being in the academic world, but at a much more relaxed pace than I was before. And I have learned a lot over the last 40 years about food and food systems. And I continue to be very interested in sharing that knowledge. And I continue to volunteer with a lot of groups, including the National Academy of Sciences and the American Society for Nutrition and others, kind of giving back and sharing some of the lessons that I have learned, with the hope that the next generation can really continue that work on food safety and nutrition to help all of us in the U.S.
Dr. Susan Mayne, thank you so much for being on Food Truths. You are an exemplar for food safety and an optimistic look forward, and it has been a pleasure to have you on the show.
It's my pleasure, Eric, and keep up communicating about the importance of food.